and welcome to the Full Scottish on Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Ruth Watson. My guests today are the author Emma Grae, whose debut novel, Be Good to Your Mammy, was shortlisted for Scotland's National Book Awards 2022, and she's currently working on her third novel, and Mike Small of Bella Caledonia, an online magazine which combines political and cultural commentary. Hello, thank you very much for joining us today. Well, before
Thanks
we
for
go
having us.
into the day's conversations, first we have the Ukraine update on day 431 of the Russian war in Ukraine. A huge fire in the Crimean port city of Sevastopol on Saturday has been put out after what was reported to be a Ukrainian drone strike on fuel tanks at a Russian Navy depot. Video footage posted on social media showed a large waterside area on fire with a column of black smoke rising from the burning fuel. The death toll from Russia's aerial attacks on cities across Ukraine early on Friday has risen to at least 26, including 5 children, as Kyiv said preparations for a counter-offensive against Moscow's forces were nearly complete. Firefighters tackled a blaze at a residential apartment hit by a Russian missile in the central town of Uman, and rescue workers clambered through a huge pile of smouldering rubble searching for survivors. 2 civilians died as a result of Ukrainian shelling on a village in Russia's Bryansk region on Saturday evening, Alexander Bogomaz, a local governor, has said. Ukraine almost never publicly claims responsibility for attacks inside Russia and on Russian-controlled territory in Ukraine. Nancy Pelosi has spoken about her surprise visit to Ukraine just after the Russian invasion had begun. Pelosi and other lawmakers were ushered secretly into Kyiv via a route that she will not divulge. It was dangerous, Pelosi told the Associated Press before Sunday's one-year anniversary of that trip. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in an interview on Saturday he carries a pistol and would have fought to the death alongside his inner circle had the Russians stormed his Kyiv headquarters at the start of the war. In the first days after the 24th February 2022 invasion, Ukrainian officials said Russian intelligence units had tried to break into Kyiv but were defeated and failed to reach Bankova Street in the centre, home to the presidential offices. There's a realistic possibility the Russian missiles that struck Ukraine on Friday were an attempt to intercept Ukrainian reserve units and military supplies that were recently given to the country, the UK Ministry of Defence said on Saturday. The bombardment killed at least 25 people and were a departure from Russia's use of long-range strikes that targeted energy infrastructure over winter, it said. Russian occupying authorities in southern Ukraine said on Saturday that Ukrainian forces were subjecting the city of Novaya Kakhovka to intense artillery fire that had cut off electricity. Novaya Kakhovka is part of the southern Kherson region that Russia controls. 5 EU countries, Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland and Slovakia, have agreed on a deal to allow the transit of Ukrainian food exports, the European Commission said, after temporary bans were imposed on the foodstuffs amidst protest by farmers. On Saturday, Russia promised it would respond harshly to what it said was Poland's illegal seizure of the Russian embassy school in Warsaw, but Poland said it was within its rights to take back the building. Well, that's the Ukrainian news, but I mean, Emma and Mike, what are your thoughts on the situation that's happening across Europe and the potential for escalation, Finland's accession to NATO and Sweden looking like it's going to be not far behind it? We're entering a very sort of dynamic stage, really, of the conflict, aren't we? Emma, what are your thoughts?
You know, obviously since the beginning, there's been a lot of questions of whether it's going to escalate. I part of me thinks it won't happen, and then part of me wonders like how desperate Putin's getting at this stage because obviously he's lost so many resources and he spent such a long time training up his army. I think it was something like 20 years. Replacing those resources is not something that he'll be able to do anytime soon. So I do wonder, but my fear would be what kind of escalation and what sort of method he would choose, especially if other countries get involved, because I don't think he's got anything to lose at this stage. He's become an international pariah.
I mean, in terms of I mean, it's very interesting because within the Western framework, he is, very much persona non grata. And yet, when you look at the BRIC alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, there's a slightly different picture. I mean, it's sort of people aren't quite as willing to take a stance sort of within that economic framework. I mean, Mike, when you're thinking about, for example, food security or for like international trade, do you get any inklings or do you have any thoughts on um, perhaps the emergence of a sort of a new world structure or the destabilizing effects, or do you think that people are maybe just watching to see how this goes?
I think there's a real sense of crisis and breakdown, but also there's glaring opportunities to be less dependent on externalities. So, for example, there was a recent crisis about minerals that had to be extracted from Ukraine for crops, and the alternative is to go to organic farming, in the same way as the alternative to fossil fuel dependency from the region is to have more renewables and an energy descent plan. So there are these opportunities there, but I think that the crisis is unfolding, and it does speak to the problem of the British state and how we see the difference between Ukrainian refugees and Sudanese refugees being treated, which smacks of racism, and the British government's immigration bill and Rwandan policy is an extraordinary one in these circumstances where we're going to see more and more refugees being displaced. So the crisis is both at home and abroad, and is being repackaged for domestic consumption.
So, I mean, looking at the Sudanese situation, which is unfolding just appallingly. I mean, a nation that has just been so riven by so the destabilized, never quite recovered from sort of the post-colonial era, and looking at the way in which the horrific stories of British nationals who have got the right to come back to this country, who are doctors and others who obviously were over in Sudan, perhaps for the celebrations of Eid, to go and see their families, and have been caught up in this. And I mean, the UK response has been so very much seemed to be on the back foot. Alison Thewlis, the SNP MP, has been taking to Westminster to task, pointing out that the United Nations says that there's no safe routes, there's no viable way to come, which was dismissed remarkably by her Tory counterpart. But as you say, the sort of the disparity between the way in which the Ukrainian refugees and Sudanese refugees are being treated,
Yeah.
how big a response do you think there is within the Scottish community? I mean, do you think that people are watching this and understanding and seeing the difference in the disparity, and how much do you think people understand that people really are left with nowhere to go? I mean, Emma, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I completely agree. Like it's definitely a Ukrainian people look like us. They have a similar culture, that kind of thing, and that's why they were treated with so much shock. Like when the Ukrainian war happened, it was all over social media. It was all over TikTok. Every generation was talking about it. You're not necessarily getting the same response with what's happening in Sudan. It's almost like we're not.
Yeah.
It's out of sight, out of mind almost to an extent. It's certainly not permeating Western culture the way that the Ukrainian conflict did at the beginning, even though I actually read in The Independent that people reportedly were killing their pets because they were frightened that they would be unable to feed them. It sounds like the situation is just as desperate, but again, for whatever reason, they're not getting the help that they need.
And so, I mean, in terms of the response that the UK government was able to do, I mean, it was quite astonishing to hear, Great Britain saying, "Well, we can't evacuate our people because the Germans have got control of the runway." I mean, does this speak perhaps of global Britain being more of a minnow than the majesty it likes to think it has on the world stage, Mike?
It's certainly acting like it.
I
Yeah,
mean,
I mean,
Mike,
there
in,
was
in
reports from there was reports from Anna McMorrin, the MP for a Labour MP for Cardiff, who was trying to get a family out. And one thing that keeps coming up again and again is if you have a family and two are British nationals and one isn't. In this case, I think it was the father. Britain was kind of saying, well, you can have some of this family um, come here, and it's extraordinary lack of humanity. Um, and this is only going to get worse. I mean, your earlier question was, what do people in Scotland do? And I think it really needs government facilitation. So we saw with Ukraine that there is an incredible well of compassion and solidarity there, but it needs to have some structure to allow legal routes and for people to put people up or support families. So it's very difficult to see how that happens unless you have two things. One, as Emma said, sort of media attention on the issue, which explains what's going on and gives focus to that crisis. And two, government-supported initiatives to then allow people to show their support and their solidarity to people fleeing crisis. And I think the other thing that, we look at this in terms of war and conflict and civil war, but if we step back, the bigger, longer term crisis is the climate crisis and climate refugees, which is a problem that is mounting in the background for years and years and is the next coming storm. So the problem of people's displacement from the very unstable world that we've created is not going away. And the idea that you can kind of play culture wars and pretend that your Rwanda scheme is either legal or going to happen, it is just a kind of farce at a British level.
In terms of the climate issue, I mean, we were seeing in April temperatures of 41 degrees in Spain already. And the conditions that people in Sudan fleeing to the Egyptian border, sitting in these appalling heats at 40 degrees, 41 degrees, and sitting in cars, the Saudis and the Egyptians who are helping to process a huge amount of these poor people. The infrastructure just isn't there. Do you think there's a case to be made that some of the Foreign Office budget, for example, foreign overseas aid budget, should be released quickly to perhaps enable facilities to be put in place in those countries that are on the borders who are providing support? Mike?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, I think this will need international efforts and collaboration. Britain's been those kind of aid grants. I think we also need to look at, the supply of weapons to the area, which Britain has been involved in. So it's not that you just need to intervene when the crisis hits. You also need to stop fanning the flames of that crisis and profiteering from it. I think in terms of a Scottish context, it's important for us to sort of think, imagine what kind of state we're trying to build that's future facing, and think about what our role in the world might be in geopolitical terms. This in the week when the British government was trying to chastise Scotland from having any presence on the world stage. So we need to kind of counterthink that and create some discussion about what our future role might be in this unstable world.
I mean, Emma, do you think that there is potential for Scots to, I mean, how much influence do you think we actually can have when we've got a Home Office that is so xenophobic?
I don't think, I think Scotland's image of itself and Scotland's attitude towards the rest of the world is a lot more compassionate than the UK as a whole. But we are living under a Tory government that has let a large portion of the population starve. The welfare state is not fit for purpose, especially with rising energy bills. I believe that something like £300 is what people get on universal credit with their rent paid. It's not enough to even look after British people. Like, if Scotland was independent, you would have a way to rebuild and to put those structures in place. Right now, the really only option is to be compassionate and to sort of, I guess, use the media within Scotland to drum up support for things like this. But I don't know how much influence you can have with the support of Westminster when it comes to accessing like large pools of money and actually enacting change, because it's obviously a completely opposing view from what Westminster wants to do with their money right now.
It's very difficult, isn't it, sort of being bystanders to these terrible conflicts and feeling fairly powerless. It's a fairly difficult thing, sort of on a basic humanitarian basis. But moving forward, I mean, the Scottish Government introduced its Victims, Witnesses and Justice Reform Scotland Bill, which includes a proposal of ending the not proven verdict, reducing jury size from 15 to 12, and piloting single judge trials for cases of rape and attempted rape amongst its provisions. I mean, on the one hand, this is something which has been long campaigned for, but on the other, it's not without controversy, especially when you think that the recent rape case where a gentleman who was 17 at the time he raped a 13-year-old in a park, the jury found him guilty, and it was the judge that gave him community service. So I mean, how much can judges be trusted really when it comes? Even thinking of Lord Justice Pickles back in his day. Yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts on this, Emma? In terms of the not proven verdict and reducing jury sizes and the like.
I think like the not proven verdict gives some degree of question to the verdict, like rather than outright being no they're innocent or no they're guilty. I think when it comes to especially cases of sexual assault, it's very, very difficult to prove things either way. There will be a lot of people who are probably guilty who there's not enough evidence to convict them. They have to be very, very sure in order to be able to do that. So I think it's probably something that's needed to an extent, because it does cast that shadow of doubt going forward, and it gives the jury that little bit more power, even if they aren't able to give a yes verdict to the trial. What really surprised me about the reform was that it's granting victims of sexual assault lifelong anonymity, but that's all, as far as I'm aware, that's been the case in England for some time. It surprised me that it wasn't in Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, Mike, there's quite a few people I've seen out there who have been saying, well, would it not be better rather than guilty and not guilty to have proven and not proven, because you're sort of the terminology being that the case has been proved or not proved, and I can see the appeal for that. But do you think that's a particularly Scottish nuance that perhaps people wouldn't be? They want to have that sort of guilty hammered home or not guilty, and therefore somebody's completely exonerated.
Well, I think that, as far as I'm aware, all Scottish political parties back the change of the not proven verdict, which to me isn't really satisfactory for either the complainant or the accused, because if you're if you're if you're not proven, that doesn't really make you feel like you're innocent. So I think that that's a confusion, and there's a sort of banal nationalism here that we hold on to something that's peculiarly Scottish just because it's peculiarly Scottish, despite the fact that it's really not working. And I think that the legislation that's proposed is to respond to the reality that the prosecution rate for rape is 47%, which is extraordinary. And when people say, oh, this has worked for hundreds of years, and you're like, well, it certainly hasn't worked for complainants of rape and sexual assault, for which the prosecution rate is appalling. So something has to change, and I think that this legislation and these reforms are very welcome.
So in terms of so my understanding of it is that you could have guilty, not guilty, and not proven, which kind of gave that middle ground, which my understanding of it was that potentially that would mean if more evidence came up, the case could be retried, and that's I may or not be correct on that. Is that not the case? My ear in my voice is telling me that's not true. Right. So the voice in my ear is telling me that not proven and not guilty are exactly the same. So in terms of the improving the rate of, for example, convictions for sexual assault and rape, I mean, given that we've got this recent case where the gentleman was found guilty by the jury did their job, but he was given this remarkably, I mean, to me, an
Yeah.
appallingly lenient sentence, and that is now being given the leave to appeal. I mean, how much can we trust the judges to get it right? You know, it's I mean, it does
My
not speak
understanding
more
is that
widely of the does not speak more widely of the general problem that there is in the way in which rape and sexual assault cases are prosecuted, and the prejudices that people have, the sort of personal prejudices that they sort of have come into play.
yes, and I think that there's a couple of things to say on that. First, that my understanding is that the judge in that case that you cite had no option but to give that response, so it wasn't in their control. Secondly, the reason that trial by jury is being questioned is over time it seems impossible to overcome the general public's myths about rape and rape victims. So, and I think the third thing is that my understanding from the proposed legislation is that there'd be special courts and specially trained judges with expertise and knowledge in this area, and that those things combined are the efforts to change the conviction rate.
So my understanding for the reason that the leave for appeal was given was because the the sentencing guidelines are that people under the age of, I think, 25, um, you know, sort of we should their youthfulness should be taken into account. However,
Yeah.
there's a part of that which says that depending on the severity of the crime and the impact then and the danger that they pose to the public, and obviously somebody who's prepared to rape a 13-year-old is you know, a danger to the public. So I think that was the point at which some of the discussion that I've seen subsequent to that is that is perhaps the point that is so so some of the commentary that I've seen around that has been that it is that you know, that perhaps the judge's verdict was not all it could have been. So it's a live case, so we need to be careful what we're saying. But I mean, in terms of reducing the jury size, for example, does that have a bearing really on the? I mean, I always thought that it was actually quite good having the large juries and an odd number, because that meant that you know, that you would never have a hung jury. There would, you know, the chances of having a hung jury were less. I mean, Emma, do you have any thoughts on the particular nuance of the Scottish system there?
Yeah, like I think the bigger the jury, the better, obviously within reason, but obviously you you've got with every jury you've got that risk of outside influence of it being prejudiced in some way. The more people involved in that jury, the less likely that is to happen. So I think smaller juries could be more problematic because people come into these cases with their own experiences that may be influencing, you know, the way that they see the trial.
Mike, what are your views on the jury size and the reasons why they're looking to reduce that to 12?
I'm not really. I don't really have expertise on that area. I'm interested in the concept of moving away from a jury levels in this particular area only. I would absolutely defend the idea of a jury in all other areas, and I would want to protect that in law and ring fence that. But I don't quite understand the consequences of the reduction of the numbers of people in a jury.
I mean, and in terms of the judge only cases, I mean, how much does this? I mean, really, the issue of trauma, and obviously the whole issue of having sort of trauma informed court cases, so that victims aren't re-traumatized by the process, or that people who are innocent aren't traumatized by the process, or as little as is possible. I mean, how far down the road do you think we are of having trauma informed legal sentencing and trials?
I personally don't think it's really that possible. I think more support can be provided to victims and to people who are giving evidence, but I think the court system, by its nature, is inherently traumatic. That's why so many sexual assaults and other crimes aren't reported, because people don't want to go through it because they have to relive that trauma in order to, you know, bring whoever is responsible to justice. I think it's really going to be about supporting victims, about the media reporting it in a fair, unbiased way, and having those the support put in place, really, even on social media. For example, if someone was commenting in a defamatory matter, that there was some way of holding them to account. But I think that the idea that you could get through it without any trauma or even minimal trauma is probably a bit short-sighted.
Yeah, you touched on a very good point there about the way in which these cases are reported. I think there's quite a lot to be said about training my colleagues in the media to perhaps report these things with greater sensitivity. So moving on to an event which is happening next weekend, which some of us may be hoping to miss, the coronation. There's can be a few of us who can have completely missed the ongoing celebrations that some will be having. And there's some really interesting sort of, I mean, the whole thing about the coronation, people like to say, oh, well, the monarchy is fantastic because, it's tradition and there, it's quite striking, So I was thinking about watching the Stone of Destiny yesterday as we're sort of heading down the road and hopefully going to be heading back up again. But watching that a couple of days ago, and you've got the sort of the National Trust folk, I think it was, or Scottish Heritage, in their fleeces and with their wee logos on, the black fleeces and their black trousers, and then you've got somebody that's like, it's kind of like out sort of like with their great big embroidered outfits and fancy. It was quite a juxtaposition of an image, really. And we hear that the new king will be having to strip down to a summit to get anointed with special oils, and now we're being asked to swear allegiance to the television when the king is being anointed, and sort of shout our hip hip hoorays and let him live forever, which just seems kind of odd. I mean, Mike, are you, Emma, are you excited about the coronation and the thought that we've got a king being anointed by God to reign over us in eternity?
I think this coronation will be curious because it's the first truly modern coronation. It will be interesting to sort of see how these traditions play out to a modern audience. Like things that are going to be, there's going to be so much social media commentary, obviously, in Queen Elizabeth, and obviously Charles and Camilla, whether they like it or not, they are quite a controversial pair, especially because of what happened in the 90s. I think the idea that someone was born to rule, never mind anointed by God, is a bit ridiculous. And I think that the UK is very divided in terms of its opinion of the monarchy. You're going to get an international curiosity at this point that gets us, but beyond that, yeah.
And Mike, what are your thoughts? Dieu et mon droit. I mean, what do you what are your views on the pageantry and what some people really believe is that this man has been placed upon us by God?
Yeah, I think it's otherworldly, and I think it's going to backfire very badly for them. I mean, the absurdities just come thick and fast. They've announced the coronation quiche, and I think that they've misjudged it. There was an opportunity for them to say, we're living in the 21st century, we're a multicultural society, and we're going to reform, we're going to change. That's been ignored, and in a way, it's kind of like a doubling down. But the reason I think it's not going to work is one that Charles doesn't have any of the karma that his mother had. He doesn't have any of the goodwill or support. We live in times of extreme poverty and the cost of living crisis. And here's this gross absurdity being presented to us. And I just think it won't really work. If you think about the era that the Queen was coronation, was it 1952, or I'm not
Yeah, I
quite
think it
sure
was
the date, but it
52.
was was sort of that date. I mean, that was an era of deference where these people were protected by the media in a way that they just aren't anymore. And we've grown up with a sort of soap opera of these bizarre characters, and I don't think you can really parade Prince Andrew in public and all of this very strange dysfunctional family and expect people to grovel and express deference in the way that they would have in the past. So I think it's going to backfire very badly for them and just show up Britain as an absurd country.
But I mean, in terms of the constitutional element, it's actually very interesting in some ways to consider that Charles and his mother actually were probably sort of the first regents who could have some sort of genuine claim to representing sort of Scottish royalty, given their heritage, sort of the Queen Mother being born in Glamis, and the connections that they have there. So, I mean, in some ways, for those royalists within the Scottish community, I guess in some ways they might be thinking that this is, when old Chuck comes to look at the Scottish honours, and actually he's perhaps a regent who does have the right to rule over Scots and be accepted by those who are of a royalist and an independence mind. It's a strange sort of dichotomy, isn't it? That there are those within Scotland who actually really like the royal family, and perhaps they might see Charles as being the real deal. Do you think the presence of all those sort of Union flagged plates in Tesco's and the supermarkets, other supermarkets are available, do you think that the fact that they're still sitting on the shelves is an indication that people aren't that bothered by it all? Or do you think that all the Rangers fans will be out on Saturday weeping into their Chuck mugs? Mike, what are your views?
I mean, I think there's various polls and surveys of the amount of public events and parties that are happening, and it shows that Scotland has a real disinterest in this. But I mean, I think what will be interesting if that disinterest moves to actual anger and revolt against it, which I think may happen. Because it's trying to put a sticking plaster. It's trying to be an act of unity across a society that's broken and divided and disfigured by poverty. And in that context, this sort of thing becomes an obscenity. And I don't think the sort of relentless media coverage and the surround sound about it does anything but exacerbate people's feeling of this just doesn't feel right at all.
I mean, in terms of some of the coverage that we've seen, it's been very interesting. There was a gentleman whose name I forget, who is going to be commenting, doing some of the commentary on it, but is also I think he's the custodian of Edinburgh Castle, and he gave some very interesting perspective and insight into the origins of the Stone of Destiny and the sort of the traditions. And he actually was giving some very nuanced perspective on the Scots origins of our traditions, and why it actually is I mean, in some of the English commentary, it's like, oh yeah, here go the Scots complaining about their stone going south. But actually, for a lot of people, it does speak of something quite fundamental. I mean, Emma, what did you make of Humza Yousaf's comments when he said he was going to be seeing it off down the road and he was going to make sure it came back again? And then a couple of days later, Alistair Jack saying that he couldn't be at the Tory conference because he was going to be standing guard to make sure the nationalists didn't steal it. I mean, it's a lump of rock that almost certainly isn't the original lump of rock, but is perhaps an 800-year-old fraud. So it's got its own heritage. What do you think that the actual stone represents, and the whole kind of I mean, in some ways, it's almost a star of the show for many Scots.
I mean, I think that it's sort of being used as a way to try and unite the United Kingdom. If people say like, what is the United Kingdom? The monarchy is probably one of the first things that come to mind. This stone, with its Scottish connections, obviously is a way of bringing the two countries together at a time when they probably couldn't be more divided. So politics was obviously going to be part of it. So yeah, I think the history of it's interesting, and I think that, you know, from a ceremonial point of view, what's going to happen will be interesting, regardless of whether you're a monarchist or not. I just think that, you know, it is, you can't get away from the absurdity of the ceremony and stuff, and it is directly contradicting, especially what the SNP and anyone who's pro-independence stands for, especially at a time when it would be impossible to deny the poverty that exists in the UK. I've not been in any Scottish train stations the past couple of weeks, but I left Birmingham New Street yesterday, no, the day before. It was covered in pictures of Charles and Camilla on like every big pillar. I'll be curious to see if anything like that exists up here. I seriously doubt it. It would probably get graffitied.
It's
That's really
interesting in
interesting,
terms of
isn't
the
it?
yeah, it's interesting in terms of the stone. You know, I mean, it is its whole purpose is as a symbol of subjugation. I mean, that's its actual purpose. You take something sacred from Scotland and you place it underneath the English monarch to sit on. I mean, that's its role. So to repackage and create a different narrative that actually this is a act of great unity is an extraordinary bit of propaganda that's being attempted because
Do you think it's working though,
it's
Mike?
no, I think it's not working at all. I think it's a ridiculous thing to do. They could have said, "Do you know what? This is ancient. This is an old thing. We've left it." They felt the need to do that, but you can't really repackage something whose actual purpose is to symbolize subjugation and make it into an act of unity. It's an impossible feat.
And it's that whole thing about spin doctors, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of, I mean, looking at the way these things are reported. I mean, and like looking at, I mean, so for example, moving on to the issue of sort of impartiality in broadcasting, which is something that we keep coming back to because it is such a crucial issue. But it's really interesting listening. I mean, I think that's why I was so surprised to hear that gentleman from Edinburgh Castle actually being given the airtime, because he was giving a really nuanced and sort of old school journalism answer, in that he was actually kind of being given the space to talk about the cracks, not just sort of pounding the sort of one-sided agenda. And I mean, we see this coming out again and again. I mean, many people are saying, well, here we've got, I mean, obviously, any politician who is suspected of wrongdoing should be fully and fairly investigated. But looking at sort of trucks, investigating the former first minister's pens and pots and pans and secateurs. Meanwhile, we've got Rishi Sunak and all of these people with all of their various allegations of wrongdoing, kind of being, where's the tent of Michel Aoun's house and yachts. And here we've got Richard Sharp having to finally step down because yet another inquiry has found out. I mean, why do we always need to wait for an inquiry is one thing. When people are in the wrong, let's just have them stand down. But we've got Sir Robbie Gibb, we've got Richard Sharp, we've got sort of the Tories trying to shape the BBC. They've tried to sell off Channel 4, and I mean, do you think that Emily Maitlis was right when she's moved from the BBC to this group, the news agents, and when she was criticising the BBC and this kind of the quest for kind of like false equivalence and sort of giving, just the BBC's kind of tying itself in knots at the moment, isn't it? It seems so scared of being privatised and sold off, and it's kind of having death by a thousand cuts. I mean, what future do you see for the BBC and for impartial journalism, Emma?
Oh, that's a big question to ask a journalist. You know, I think it's difficult because there's so many outlets out there that do strive to be impartial. They do not have a political agenda, but I do think it's good to have a political agenda in the sense that you're going to have supporters who are interested in that. I think there's a place for both. I just don't think that with the BBC being funded by taxpayer money and TV licenses, like the idea that it would be aligned with the Tory party in the way that it appears to be is kind of ridiculous, bearing in mind how it's funded. If it was funded privately by supporters of that particular agenda, that would be a different thing. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting. I mean, obviously the amount of people that are watching television and getting their news from there is decreasing. Most people are getting their news online in some form or another, whether that's through social media, specific apps. But yeah, most people aren't getting their news from the old school BBC, ITV reports in the way that they did in the past.
And Mike, I mean, what do you think are the key issues that we need to look at, as the BBC looks at its sort of future chairing structure? There's quite a lot of calls for there to be an impartial body that's behind it, but can you see that ever happening, given the Conservatives have got a long track record of wanting to just privatise it and be done with it?
Yeah, I think governments at Westminster of whatever hue will want to control the BBC, and so that reform remains unlikely. I mean, I think that the Richard Sharp thing was really a fiasco that kind of unfolded for months, and you're looking just incredulous at the process and the lack of transparency and the overt political bias that it exposed. I mean, I think there's two things here. One is that the BBC isn't a uniform thing. There's good and there's bad bits of it. There's the political bias, but then there's good journalism within that and good production within it. But I would want to defend the concept of public broadcasting, but it becomes increasingly difficult to do that because the two things get confused. And the BBC's political bias, overt political bias, means that it's really difficult to still defend that underlying concept of the public broadcaster, and people almost begin to forget what that might be, and it's difficult to imagine what that could be. But I think the idea of public broadcasting in an era of private media is a really important concept to defend, and it's just a pity that it becomes so difficult to do that in this context. And I think within Scotland, it's very noticeable that broadcasting and media was never devolved, and there's obviously very good political reasons for that. So even in a Scottish context, it's very difficult to build the institutions of a public broadcaster and say, this is how we could do this better. This is what this kind of model looks like.
I mean, I have to declare an interest in that. I worked for the BBC back in the days when it was something that I was proud of. And I remember sort of back in the sort of 80s and 90s when it became mooted, that it became obvious that the BBC, that the Conservatives wanted to privatise it. And we were all going, oh, that'll never happen. Of course, how could that happen? People love the BBC. But it's the same thing you see with the NHS, is that
Yeah.
something gets so eviscerated and undermined by the people holding the purse strings that eventually people fall out of love with it, and then it can be taken away and suddenly you realise what you've lost. And in terms of the BBC in Scotland, I mean, I know for a fact that they got rid of all the old school that really knew what they were talking about, and started hot housing people, took away their desks, and sort of basically just made people very fearful for their jobs, and then started sort of outsourcing lots of the programs. So now you get programs that are made in Scotland, but absolutely often it's a team that's been brought up from London to make the programs on Scottish budgets. It's very difficult to see where the BBC can go to in Scotland without change. I mean, is there anything that you guys think, Emma, I could see you're kind of looking like you wanted to say something there. Is there,
Yeah, I
what
mean, I
can
think
we
you're
do?
touching upon a wider problem within the UK in the media industry, which is that it's almost entirely London centric. The vast majority of the work for journalists, for producers, is in London. That's where all the major TV studios are. What exists in Scotland is comparatively minimal. And I should know that because for me, the only solution to being able to work in that industry really is to be in England at this stage. If Scotland was independent, I would maybe have more opportunities up here. So almost like I can kind of understand why those crews are getting sent up from London, because that's where the people with the most experience tend to be. And a lot of them are Scottish. Like maybe there's an argument to be made that it should be people with Scottish connections who are perhaps working on these Scottish shows. But yeah, there's a massive problem there, and I think I don't know how you get away from that, because as within England as well, there's a lot of people in Manchester, for example, who don't want to live in London, they don't want to live near London, but they're sometimes they get forced into it whether they like it or not.
So, I mean, do you think that that's something that within independent Scotland, sort of, Mike? I'm sure that's something that you've spent a lot of time thinking about. Is what kind of media framework you would like to see?
Yeah, like I think like obviously you don't know what anything's going to look like in an independent Scotland until it happens, but I think it would be interesting to see like how impartial any broadcaster created on the backs of presumably license fees, if it followed a similar structure to the BBC, would be within Scotland, and how it would sit within the wider framework of the UK if the BBC as it exists right now still existed in England. Would it be BBC England, BBC Scotland? Would they still have some sort of collaboration? But yeah, I think that in theory, there would be more opportunities because there would be that much more focus on Scotland as an independent state. Right now, it's the UK, and they can kind of, because of that, they can operate very easily from London. And it's the same with even with the TV shows; they're still UK as they are, even if they are crews, like you said, sent up from London to film in Scotland.
So, I mean, looking at the media, but with a perspective at the Hamza Yusuf as his first month as first minister. I mean, it's been quite a month, hasn't it? I mean, for your first month, it's not, you couldn't really say. I mean, he's had plenty of column entries and plenty of airtime. But I mean, Mike, what's your perspective on the way in which the media has tried to frame the narrative around Hamza Yusuf as First Minister, and how do you think he's handled that? Mike?
I think he's handled it quite well. I think it's a crisis that doesn't really lend itself to just saying, do you know what, things are just going to keep carrying on the way they are, everything's fine. I think the level of crisis that the SNP is in is huge, and we don't really know the full ramifications of it. We don't really know how that legal investigation is going to pan out. So I don't think we're quite in a position to see. But I think that there's an odd thing going on in terms of the hostility to Hamza Yusuf and the nationalist movement, in that there's elements within the nationalist movement that are against the Justice Reform Bill, against the bottle deposit scheme, against gender reform, against almost anything that Scotland does to make itself distinct or progressive or innovative, and don't want any change in Scotland from the elected government. So that's a really bizarre place to be in, where you've actually got a kind of unity of the right wing unionist elements and the populist nationalist elements who are completely united in opposing any changes within contemporary Scottish politics, policy, and legislation. So that's a very strange place to be in. And we also have this sort of new phenomenon of what's called a shadow government within around Kate Forbes, and that being promoted the by by the Commonweal, a supposedly left-wing think tank, and the Times and the Spectator and right-wing unionist press. So we live in very strange times, and it'll be interesting to see whether Hamza Yusuf can survive through this very strange process.
What do you think, Emin? What do you think it would? I mean, do you think that Hamza is, within his first month, has he made himself? Has he managed to sort of stamp his own seal on the kind of first minister that he's going to be? What kind of month do you think he's had, given the travails he's had to deal with?
I don't think it would have been possible. I think there's so many eyes still on Nicola Sturgeon, especially with the garden incident and things like that. I just think that there's no way he could do it without making, I guess, waves in a bad way. Like it was touched upon, this idea that Scottish politics right now, there is like a left and a right wing within the pro indie movement, and he's going to have to position himself in such a way to really appeal to both if he's going to bring the country together in any kind of way that's going to enact change. But I think what people need to realise within that is that independence is about more than just one political party. It's about Scotland as a whole. But the problem that the SNP has is sort of deciding where it is politically on like issues like gender reform, because they are so divisive.
It's interesting, though. I mean, not to go down the gender reform route, but there are a number of nations around the world that have managed to bring this legislation forward without any issues really at all, because
Mm.
the issue is it's illegal. I mean, all of the issues that the gender recognition, the complaints and fears seem to be, are actually based in the qualities legislation. And all the Gender Recognition Act does is provide people with the legal identity to match their lived identity. So it's very strange. I mean, in some ways, it's a real success of the kind of the culture wars agenda, that something which it isn't has been, a piece of legislation has been sort of turned into something which it really isn't, and people don't really seem to be paying attention to the detail of it. But I mean, I guess that's a sort of slightly separate issue to what we're discussing at the moment. But I mean, in terms of, it's interesting because watching the First Minister's sort of leadership debate, one of the media commentators made a really good point, and it was like looking at Kate Forbes, Ash Regan, and Humza Yousaf was kind of like looking at the three kinds of parties that would emerge after Scotland gets independence, because you've got Humza Yousaf, who's on the left, and sort of then increasingly to the right, with conservatism with a small c, with Kate Forbes and Ash Regan. I mean, in some ways, it's almost natural and quite healthy that we're getting these different sections of the pro-Indie movement sort of emerging, because that will show us the kind of developments we'll have after independence. But do you think that it's that the wider Yes movement is going to get its act together again and go, okay, guys, come on, actually this is about Scotland. It's not about who's doing what or peeing where. Mike?
There's quite a lot in there. I think you're right, first of all, to recognise that with a lot of proposed legislation, if we go back to the Justice Reform Bill, that those trials and that innovation is currently happening in France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. The bottle deposit schemes have been around Europe and Northern Europe for 30, 40 years. This isn't very difficult. As you mentioned about gender reform legislation in other countries, that's gone forward without any real, significance. So we're in this bizarre situation where any change is resisted, often from people who are proponents of constitutional change. That's a very strange position to be in. I don't know if I share the analysis that the emergent wings within the SNP represent a healthy political pluralism. I just don't think they are. I think they're more like toxic infighting and opportunistic. So I don't really see how supposedly left-wing people support Kate Forbes. I think that's because they hate the SNP leadership rather than they've got some grand vision or represent some interesting politics. So I'm a little bit more pessimistic about that sort of levels of discussion.
So, but Emma, I mean, in terms of the way forward, I mean, you're in a really interesting position because you're watching this, because you sort of live in three different places, sort of international woman of mystery. You get the chance to see Scotland from afar as well as at home. So, I mean, when you're talking to people or when you're looking at things from away, what kind of perspective do you think that gives you, and what are your thoughts on the direction things are taking?
It just, like, right now it seems very chaotic. Like, it doesn't seem like there's any unity. It doesn't seem like Scotland looks very good in terms of a country that could govern itself because of the division within the leadership. You really, really are going to need some strong leader that will bring everybody together. Like,
Oh dear, I think we're having some problems hearing Emma. I think your internet's gone a wee bit shiggly there, Emma. I don't know if you want to try giving it a hit your dongle and give it another try.
Can
Oh,
you hear
you're
me
back.
now?
You're back. Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I think that like from the view of Scotland from England, it's very divided. I think most English people, unless they've got some Scottish connection, don't really care if Scotland stays or not. That's sort of the impression that I get. It's sort of like if Scotland wants to do that, then go for it. They're not particularly invested in it. It tends to be people who have some sort of Scottish connection but are based in England or whatever themselves that tend to be a bit more vocal with their view. That's just my experience. It's only one person's view of things, but I do think that if Scotland's going to have any chance of independence in the near future, they really need a strong leader, and whether Hamza steps up to that kind of remains to be seen. But I think Scotland, in terms of the way that the outside world views it, it does come across as a more left-leaning country than England at the moment under the Tory government. And if Scotland was to go more in the might almost be at this seeing itself more with the United Kingdom in.
Well, I mean, I think that it's very interesting when you hear, you look at the cabinet that Hamza Yusuf has brought in. I mean, we've got two ministers which have got well-being in their in their purview, and the Independence Minister Jamie Hepburn. I mean, I know that he has been meeting with the National Yes Network this morning. Believe in Scotland last week. I think Highlands and Islands. He met with them last week as well. I mean, how how do you think um, the kind of ministerial portfolio that he's brought forward? How do you think that speaks to his intentions? And we've only got a couple of minutes left, so Mike, I'll ask you first.
I think it's good to be speaking to the movement and speaking to the grassroots. I think that there needs to be evolve a new strategy, and I think that we're at a kind of a nadir, a kind of lowest point, and it's important to recognize that and not just pretend that everything's okay. So I think we need to start again, start afresh, and come up with new ideas and not just pretend that what we've been doing is going to work. So I think we need some radical rethinking, and I'd be surprised if that minister is able to do that, but I'd be very welcome if he is.
And Emma, I mean, I know that the former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, was at an event over the weekend, and I've been speaking to some of the people who were there with her, and the view that was being relayed is that that none of this would be happening if MI5 and the Tory government weren't, or the unionist government down south weren't really shaken up with the direction that Scotland looks like taking. I mean, do you think that the nadir that we are at may end up sort of resulting in hubris on Westminster's part in terms of perhaps they're kicking the can too hard and people are going to resist?
I mean, I think Westminster will always try and exert its authority over Scotland, almost to remind Scotland of its place. And we saw that with the gender reform bill getting blocked. It was almost like, right, just remember that this is where you are. Um, so yeah, it's a tricky one. Like I think with having like a devolved government and stuff, like how powerful is Scotland under the current system? And obviously, like I mean, next weekend it's going to be a massive discussion about what is the UK, what does that mean, even though the two places are clearly very different politically. I mean, Brexit and stuff's a good example of that. So yeah, I think it's really too early to sort of say what the next 5 years in Scottish politics in relation to Westminster is going to look like. I mean, I'm hoping obviously that the Tory party does not survive another election, and that I wonder how that will affect Scotland and how that will affect the support for independence, because right now for it is obviously only growing by the day.
Well, that's a good cliffhanger to end the show on. So that's it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, although we do take one-off donations. Right now, we have a pressing need to raise £30,000 to pay our bills and ensure that we are able to continue making programmes. So if you've got a wee bit that you can stick into the coffers, that'd be very much appreciated. Thank you again to our guests, Mike Small of Bella Caledonia and Emma Grae, author. Check out her books, Be Good to Your Mammy, and is it Get Your Dancing Shoes On, Get Your Dancing Feet
The
On?
Tongue She Speaks is the second one that's out.
I beg your pardon. I beg
That's
your
all
pardon.
right.
The Tongue She Speaks. And I'm Ruth Watson. Ruth Watson, I'll get that right. Goodbye, and thank you very much for watching.